Welcome. Thank you for joining us here in the Design Talks Theater for Design Miami. I want to say a couple things before we jump into the program. First of which, my name is Germane Barnes. I am a professor here at the University of Miami, where I direct the graduate program. I want to thank Anna Karnick, this year's creative director for Design Miami, for allowing us to host this talk. I'd also like to thank Tatiana Strick of Design Academy Saaleck for sponsoring this talk and allowing our young people to be a part of the conversation. So just so you all know the way this is going to go, I'm going to introduce our amazing panelists. They're going to talk a bit about their work, and then we'll have a couple directed questions from myself as the moderator, and then we'll open it up to Q&A for everyone out here in the crowd. That sound like a plan? Cool. All right. So let me do some introductions for these amazing people here to my left. So we're going to go all the way to the left and start with Adam Nathaniel Furman. He's an artist, designer, writer, and academic. His work is characterized by bright colors, bold patterns, and ornaments. They're a vocal LGBTQIA+ advocate and co-wrote the recently acclaimed Queer Spaces, an atlas of LGBTQIA+ places and spaces. His studio is based in London. He's here to come hang with us for a few days. If you'd like to follow him on Instagram, I'm sure if you Google him, his name will come up. Next to him is Nina Cooke John, an architect and designer and founder of Studio Cooke John, and an educator at Parsons and Columbia University. In 2022, she was anointed a USA Rice Fellow, and her practice is dedicated to creating a sense of belonging through design. Some recent high-profile projects include the Harriet Tubman Monument in Newark, New Jersey, and the Point of Action Monument in Brooklyn, New York, which connected people in a socially distanced way. And then last, but certainly not least, the formidable, don't nod your head at me, the formidable Jadi Amazi. She is a principal at Mass Design Group. She directs the firm's Public Memory and Memorials Lab. She currently works out of Boston. I won't tell you where she lives, because some of you might be trying to find her. The lab is an initiative that advances research, training, and built work around a central thesis that spatializing memory can heal us and inspire collective action for generations to come. Can we get a round of applause for our speakers? Okay, so I'm going to set the stage for our conversation. In Saaleck, there is a design academy, which I just mentioned, here on the screen. And as the artistic director of this initiative, the theme was monuments. This picture here on the left is actually based here in South Florida, in Miami specifically. If you go along Northwest 12th Avenue, you may never notice this. It is once a historical segregation wall that blocked the black neighborhood from the white neighborhood in Liberty City. If you've ever seen the award-winning movie Moonlight, it was filmed there. The image on the right, we're all familiar of. After the Floyd riots of 2020, people wanted to reclaim the streets, and we started to open a conversation of what does it mean to put work into built space? Who do we celebrate? How do we come up with this criteria? So this house is in Saaleck. This house is designed by a Nazi sympathizer named Paul Schutzennaumburg. It's in Naumburg. And a part of our work was seeing how do we utilize this space and bring all of the communities that he would have never wanted to this location. And so we came up with a theme. I won't spare you to have to read that. Essentially, it's again about monumentality. This guy on the left, Zeno Franchini, he was our head mentor. And these were the amazing artists that we brought to Saaleck for 2.5 weeks to do site-specific installations based around these specific themes. And we conducted workshops, tours, and visited historic sites across Germany. And most importantly, we had deep conversations that were typically around our dinner table, so we can talk about these various themes of monumentality, which unfortunately marginalizes a significant amount of people around the globe. So these three amazing people to myself have their own bodies of work that also deal with the same topic. So just a few more examples before we jump directly to our people, okay? So that's the stage. Stage is set. Go for
it. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, let's try that one more time. I come from a call and response community. Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, that's much better. Thank you. I am very excited to be here. Flew in from Boston this morning, so I really appreciate the warmth with which you all just welcomed me. As Germane said, I am Amazi. I'm a principal at Mass Design Group, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our work, particularly through the Public Memory and Memorials Lab. And so first and foremost, for those that are not familiar, Mass Design Group is a nonprofit design collective. Just a point of clarification, MASS stands for Model of Architecture Serving Society. It does not stand for Massachusetts, although one of our largest offices is in Boston, Massachusetts. And as a nonprofit design collective, we do believe that design is never neutral. It either hurts or heals. So as a result of that, our mission as an organization is to research, build, and advocate for design that promotes justice and human dignity. And we do that by working in partnership with other mission-aligned organizations. We are a team of over 250 plus interdisciplinary folks. So we are architects, landscape architects, engineers, writers, filmmakers, graphic designers, interior designers, you name it. We probably have someone that has studied in that particular field. And we are representing over 20 countries in our 4 studios. So we have Boston, Poughkeepsie, New York, Santa Fe, New Mexico, and Kigali, Rwanda. And the work that I lead specifically is our Public Memory and Memorials Lab, which is based on this thesis, on this question of how can spatializing memory support healing and inspire collective action for generations to come? How can our work ultimately catalyze future generations to challenge how it is that we are building and perpetuating the norms and policies, if you will, in our public realm? And so in our work, we understand that memorials have the power to remind us of who we once were so that we may understand who we are and, more importantly, decide who we want to become. And on my next 3 slides, you'll see that I have some of our projects as well as other projects and references to memorial work, because we certainly understand that we are not doing this work on our own, but that we are actually part of a larger group of folks that are actually challenging these notions and asking these very important questions as we are in a phase of critiquing our current memorial landscape. And so several projects through which we are doing this work will be included, and the first one here is the Writing on the Wall project, which we did on the High Line in partnership with artist Hank Willis Thomas and scholar and advocate Hass Barringer. And what you see in this particular project are a series of gallery spaces with letters from formerly and currently incarcerated folks, created as an opportunity to really humanize their experiences and invite visitors to sit and contemplate with what it means to be in those cells, in those places where your freedom is being challenged, and actually think about those human experiences. Temporary exhibit. Second, there on the bottom, you're seeing the Gun Violence Memorial Project, which we first exhibited at the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2019. It then moved to the National Building Museum during most of the pandemic and is actually due to arrive at the ICA in Boston in August of 2024. And this is a project that we've done in collaboration with Purpose Over Pain, an organization based in Chicago, founded by 2 mothers, both who had their sons taken due to gun violence on separate occasions, who challenged our team to ask us what would it mean to create a memorial to victims of gun violence. We met these intrepid women at the opening for the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, of which Mass Design Group is the architects and landscape architects, and they talked about their experiences. They reflected on how transformative that particular memorial was, and they asked us what would it look like to create a memorial to an ongoing epidemic. So this particular project is composed of 4 glass houses. Each house is made up of 700 bricks. 700 is the number of Americans that were killed on a weekly basis due to gun violence in this country in the year of 2018. And so what we are doing there is we are inviting family members of these gun violence atrocities to submit objects on behalf of their loved ones, objects that represent their personality, interests, passions, and so forth, such that we might be able to capture and reflect, again, the humanity of this epidemic and actually have a conversation about the intimacy of this epidemic. And in doing so, representing both the infinite and the intimate, understanding that too often gun violence is reduced to statistics, and not often enough is it actually reflective of the individuals that are impacted by it. Additionally, we understand in our work that the world, the built environment, is a proliferation of these symbols. And these symbols are also never neutral. They are either helping or hurting or healing us. And so we are working directly in contrast to this and thinking about how can we have radical truth-telling and healing in our public memorial landscape. So two projects that also kind of reflect that in a way are projects that we're working on in Texas, one in Sugar Land and the other in Houston. In Sugar Land, we are honoring the Sugar Land 95, which are 95 victims of convict leasing. And in Houston, we are working with the Commissioner's Office on 3 city Houston blocks connecting from the old county courthouse out to the bayou. And in that project, we are focusing on the intersection of art and restorative justice. Both projects are looking to make the connections between slavery and modern day incarceration and thinking about how in our public realm we can properly educate ourselves and our future generations, particularly understanding that our educational system is currently under fire. We will not go there in this lecture, or maybe we will. Lastly, we're constantly understanding and thinking about how the construction of public memory lends weight to very particular narratives, which brings us to ask ourselves and our partners who or what is deemed important, whose voices are we learning and hearing from, but more importantly, whose voices are being left out. And so in that, we are working to expand narratives in the public realm. We are working within the context of what is already built to understand how we can add on to that and layer in our individual unique experiences, because currently our memorial landscape represents a very small, singular population of who we are and what we hope to become, and we are working to expand that. And one project that is exemplary of that is the Embrace in the 1965 Freedom Plaza that was unveiled a year ago in my home city of Boston, Massachusetts. And this project looks to honor the Kings, MLK and Coretta Scott King, in a public space, but it does so in a way that actually is not focused on their legacy as civil rights activists, but actually is focused on their love and on their experiences as individuals. And it also is intentionally looking to lift up local civil rights activists in a conversation that moves us away from singular hero worship and instead focuses on collective action. And so in that way, we are looking again to expand the narratives of whose stories are being told and celebrated in our public realm. So I look forward to expanding on some of that in our conversation, and I will pass it to Nina.
Am I on now? Great. So again, I'm Nina Cooke-John, and my studio is Studio Cooke-John Architecture and Design. And after about 20 years in practice, our studio has recently expanded into working in the public realm through public art. And so during the pandemic, the first public installation project, which was installed in November of 2020, really exemplifies some of the future work, which is looking to ideas of visibility, invisibility, and connectedness in public space and what that might mean. And for this project, again, in the middle of the pandemic, realizing those around us who we might have seen every day who had been invisible to us, like our essential workers, but also issues that might have been invisible to many of us that were exposed when we found out that hundreds and thousands of school kids in New York City public school system depended on school lunches, and that became evident to everyone once they no longer could go to school. And so how could we, through a process of a formal investigation and a spatial investigation, create portals through which we could allow people to step out of their busy lives and see and be seen? So this investigation was a combination of bent metal structures layered with rope, which created these portals, each which sat on a 6-foot circle, socially distanced, creating these spotlights for people to engage with each other, and also to look back upon the city in a way of kind of re-understanding and re-seeing the everyday in this new means. And so though it was originally installed, it was a temporary installation in the Flatiron Plazas, it moved and is now on view at the Wassaic project. So taking on a new life in a suburban, actually rural setting where once it was in an urban setting and a part of the kind of everyday life of the city. The next project I want to talk about is the Harriet Tubman Monument in Newark, New Jersey. And the context for this project was that in June of 2020, during the same time that monuments around the world were being taken down because they were symbols of oppression and pain in many cities, the Christopher Columbus statue in Newark, New Jersey was removed. The night of its removal, the artist Sherzad Tillett took the photo of the young girl you see on the left. That night, it was her birthday, and she was there as part of what was a celebration, this removal. And it started a project called Will You Be My Monument, where Sherzad actually created these podiums on a much-used street in Newark and invited young girls of varying sizes to stand on the podium and rethinking this question of who should be monumentalized in public and how can we reimagine what monuments are. And so in answering the call for the Harriet Tubman Monument, which would sit on the same site of the Columbus statue, really for me, it was bifurcating the singular understanding of what a monument was, a statue standing in a space that you walk around and look at from afar, as something that you engage with, move in and through, and have a direct connection with. So it was important that it claimed space for Harriet Tubman in a park that still has statues to other men, in addition to having people walk in and through it. And so as part of the conceptualization of the monument, we had workshops across the city over the course of a year where we had participants answer the prompt, what does liberation mean to you? Big or small tasks of liberation. We captured those stories in these tiles, these ceramic tiles that became this mosaic embedded in the monument, but also in audio stories. So there's audio that's embedded in the speakers throughout the monument. And so the result is a multi-sensory immersive experience in re-understanding the singular story of Harriet Tubman that we might have learned, understanding her as a human, as a woman, so that we can better be inspired by her, but also expanding her story to include those of the Underground Railroad that supported her, the Newark liberation community in the city that supported more direct acts of liberation. And so on the inner Court 10 wall, we have the historical information of the Newark Liberation Society, and then on the outer wood wall was the story of Harriet Tubman's life. And it was important to include her likeness in the monument, even though I usually work in the abstract, so that they could see their stories reflected back in a real way. And so, between texture and lighting and the people's actual stories, it becomes spaces where they can reflect on their own stories, Tubman's stories, and then it also becomes a community space that activates the park in multiple ways through the different sizes of activities that happen in the park and beyond. And then the very last project that I'll talk about really briefly is in Alexandria, Virginia. It was temporary installation from March and November of this year, and it's called 2 Boxes of Oranges in Edmonia Jackson. It was inspired by, through our research, the image of an archaeological dig that was found on the site. It was buried ships, which they used to build up the port of Alexandria, but it really led us to think about the city that people visit as a a city really rich in history, what layers of history actually exist here, and how can we peel up and exist the different layers of history that exist at the same time but aren't oftentimes talked about. So as the blue was directly related to the water and the port, and really this idea of peeling up and revealing on the underside the text of the cargo that often was in these ships. So molasses, rum, gin, but also Amanda, 5'3", 18 years old, which were part of the domestic and transatlantic slave trade. So it really starts to layer different kinds of history of Alexandria for us to really reconsider how different histories exist in the same place at the same time. And the city of Alexandria also commissioned different activations, and this was one artist that responded to the work in dance and spoken word. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, is it working? Okay. So back in 2013, I worked on a project at the Design Museum called Identity Parade. And I created a fictional character. It's kind of often a way for me when I'm doing research to actually kind of immerse myself within the work with a kind of sense of critical distance while still being very much present within it. I created a fictional character who was locked in their apartment for 3 months. And every single day, that person had to live their life through social media, online activities, and at the same time, they had to create an object every single day. And that object either had to be made in the apartment that they lived in, or it had to be delivered. So basically, it had to be 3D printed, laser cut, or made at home with clay. And that was used as a vehicle, that kind of fictional scenario was used as a vehicle to explore the creation of about 70 objects, which all used various fabrication technologies. But rather than looking at issues of commerce or issues of representation of technology or the zeitgeist, they were all meant to be little monuments for the everyday quotidian difficulties of a paradigmatic Western 21st century designer. And it was looking at how using kind of all of the material capacity to hand that one has as a 21st century designer, you can embody kind of states of identity through form, color, and aesthetics, very much at the scale of the domestic and of the interior. This was followed by a project at the British Academy in Rome, which was the UK Rome Prize project for that year, which was 2014-15, which looked at the same kind of question, but at the urban scale. So it was taking a 21st century kind of grand tour of Rome, but looking at it from a perspective of forgotten histories or alternative histories. So whereas previously each object had a very personal story that was embodied through the aesthetics and the form, here there were different stories of characters and communities in the city of Rome over the past 2,000 years that haven't been told within architectural cultural discourse, the mainstream architectural discourse. And those were each embodied through architectural designs, which in a similar way to those objects, but at the scale of the city, embodied all of the issues that were explored in each of those stories, but at the aesthetic level. So they kind of communicated themselves rather than having to be told through a narrative. Each one of these stories, which were published, I think, every 2 weeks in the Architectural Review, so they were kind of written up as kind of coherent little narratives. And all of these were kind of based on objective historical stories that were discovered in Rome. But then they were reduced down to kind of tchotchkes, I guess, souvenirs, kind of poetic, expressive, atmospheric objects of kind of compressed aesthetics that were meant to embody the broader issues that they were exploring. So again, little monuments telling stories of difference from histories that are not normally recorded. And this is something that I've looked at at various scales, from furniture, also through to writing and activism. So when I write about these issues, I try and discuss the city as a place of symbolic difference, or a place that should be a parliament of symbolic difference, but where what you actually have is a dogmatic repetition of the status quo. And there's kind of a lot of reasons that that happens, but it's extremely rare that outside of Carnival or Pride, anyone with any kind of difference is allowed to express that and embody that permanently, aesthetically, in the city. So most of us don't see ourselves represented in the city around us. And I've been very forceful in the past. I'm trying to be a lot less forceful. But humor is also an important way of kind of marking space within the city. That can be done through little objects, through interiors. It can be done through carnival floats. It can also be done through messaging on clothing. So for a while I had these sort of comical but pointed kind of merch objects which were worn by students, marking a kind of difference, or little monuments of difference within university contexts. And I've also done kind of, I guess, visionary projects that were commissioned, looking at how we could once again, this is a commission to kind of imagine a new type of town hall for the United Kingdom in the 21st century. And I kind of try and think about architectures and also the public spaces of our cities as frameworks for the embodiment and the representation of difference through material culture and aesthetics from different community groups. So the representation in permanent form of different taste cultures, which are normally excluded from the city apart from on kind of allowed moments of the year. As you might imagine, I also have done some competition proposals. This was for an extension to the British Library. As you might imagine, this was not chosen. It's now going to be a Richard Rogers building, another Richard Rogers building. And also, occasionally I get commissioned to kind of imagine monuments for larger urban contexts that are specific. So this was for central Barcelona, invited by the city for the Model Festival a couple of years ago to imagine a new Arc de Triomphe for the city that kind of marks the progression of queer liberation over the past 100 years in that city. And an important part of these projects for me is the kind of, I guess, the taking back of traditional monumentality, or the demanding of space within this traditional city for kind of the existence of different taste cultures. And I also do a lot of temporary projects with community groups and charity groups. This is a project for the Birmingham Commonwealth Games, which was last year, working with Fierce Festival, looking at the many different types of genders which have been erased by the British, now called the Commonwealth and previously the Empire. And this was a temple to remember them within. We kind of slightly had to slip that in under the radar from the official curators. This is in Germany. Oh, there were some more slides. And I'm just going to finish on, and I kind of tried to do various projects, bringing in different alternative communities into the city space. And just to conclude, the book is really important as a kind of archive which acts as a tool for giving or empowering queer students, particularly within the design and architecture world, to have access to or have an accessible way to get through to their own history, which empowers people to be able to produce the new. So in a way, it's a kind of place of memory in the form of a book, which allows the creation of new monuments and new spaces through the empowerment of passing people a history which otherwise they don't have access to, particularly in the world of architecture.
So I'm going to get us started with a couple questions, and please feel free to raise your hand for follow-ups. But before I start, I just want to make sure, can everyone in the back hear us very clearly? Just want to make sure that you are, okay, awesome. We got some very soft-spoken people. I want to make sure you guys are actually hearing everything in the back. So we're going to start with the elephant in the room. And I would like each of you to answer this. Do we need monuments?
Oh, I didn't realize we were going in order. That's fine. Yes, we do. I think as long as we continue to have people in places, and as long as we continue to tell our stories and perpetuate what we deem important through the built environment, which I think we're going to do as humans forever, monuments, I think, are but a tool in doing that. We have books, we have art, we have clothing, we have all these other medias and tools by which we are telling our stories, and I feel like monuments, although evolved, is the question. Do we need them? Yes. Do they need to evolve? Of course. I think monuments are a way to continue to do that, and they are certainly a way to continue to have conversations around healing in our public spaces. So I say yes, we do.
Memory to turn it on. So I see monuments as places of memory, right? Places of concentrated memory and what that might mean. And those continue to be important for what I think we've all said, in that history and the telling of history and the telling of multiple stories, historical stories that are often suppressed, need to be told in public. Because that's where we connect to each other. That's where we connect to each other's histories. And I think that's where we understand how to build a future world in which we can understand that we exist there as well.
Yes. I guess my position would be that everything that we build, all material culture that humanity puts out, monumentalizes something whether or not it wants to. And it's just whether or not we recognize what it is representing. You know, the majority of buildings that are being put up just represent the kind of bland violence of our neoliberal financial system. And that's just treated as neutrality or universalism. And of course it's not. And so for me, it's like, I think where everything we produce is a monument. It's just whether or not we're going to be honest about what it represents, and whether we talk about whether what these things represent are things that we want to be represented. So yes, I think monuments happen anyway, but I think it's just great that people are talking about them more consciously now.
Can we take an informal poll of the audience? Can you please raise your hand if you think we need monuments? Raise your hand if you think we do not need monuments. Oh, you're on your own. You're a lone ranger. You got one more with you here. So, in looking at all of your work, how do we deal with uncomfortable monuments, or monuments that might have a murky history? How do we tell those stories while still being true to the actual events that have happened? Do we use it to promote healing, or just as a moment in time to say this is something that happened at a specific period? Anyone of you?
I'll jump in only because, the Harriet Tubman Monument sits on the site of what had been the Christopher Columbus statue. And that was a very controversial decision by the city of Newark and the people of Newark to take down what they thought was a hurtful symbol. And in our design, we actually decided to keep an outline of the pedestal of that monument within our monument. Because understanding that history is layered, that history is never going to go away. The Columbus statue stood there, and it meant something. It meant something to the Italian-American community in the city, and it meant something in terms of monumentalizing Columbus. But it also means something in terms of our understanding of history also evolves. Our understanding of those who we monumentalize evolves. And so how do we incorporate living memory, living monuments, and living responses to both the uncomfortable heroes, anti-heroes in our community, and what we do to respond to those?
Would either of you like to answer?
I can't remember what the question was.
It was, how do we deal with uncomfortable monuments? Monuments that are rife with blurry and murky history. But is it a moment in time, or is it a way of us thinking through catalyzing further moments?
Did you want to? I would say it's a little bit of both. It's certainly about capturing a moment in time, but it should be more about catalyzing future, I don't want to say things, but that's the best word I have for y'all right now, but future actions, future education, future dialogue in terms of thinking about what does this particular memorial or monument teach us, and how can we learn from it and learn from our past mistakes as a society, as a country, as a people, in order to prevent atrocities like whatever is being memorialized from happening again. And so, for example, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which a lot of folks do refer to as the lynching memorial, is a very uncomfortable topic, is a very uncomfortable memorial, and the experience that one has is meant to put your body in a place of discomfort. But it is also meant to bring you through a journey that ultimately ends in hopefulness, such that you can leave from the space transformed, catalyzed, thinking about what you can do in your societies on your scale as an individual to ensure that some of the racial terror that certainly happened at a disgusting level and scale in this country does not ever happen again, but also that some of the subdued systemic racial terror that is continuing in this country can continue to be challenged and critiqued and thought about. And so I think it is important to have these memorials that, you know, certainly are uncomfortable and that grapple with these difficult conversations, but it's necessary to do so in a way that is not traumatizing or re-triggering, but gives us a sense of hope and leaves us with a sense of a call to action, if you will, and thoughts about what you can be doing on an individual scale.
Just in terms of discomfort with previous narratives, which have gone out of, I guess, sort of gone out of kind of general acceptance. I think history is contentious. It always will be. It's not based on facts. It's interpretation of facts, and also facts which are, as I discovered with the Queer Spaces book, consistently and brilliantly erased over many generations. So actually the act of finding, and actually fiction is so important in my work because very often so much of the historical catalogue has been destroyed, very often literally burnt. And I see a lot of people getting very upset about monuments being removed, and I just don't understand why they're upset, because things change, the way we interpret history change, our society evolves, and the kind of embodiment of the history that we consider valuable that is represented in our cities necessarily will change as well. So I just think it's up to each location, each city to have its debate, and there's no universal answer. I definitely don't have one. And then in terms of difficult, kind of, I guess, memorializing very difficult situations, I've worked on a few Holocaust memorials. I'm working on one at the moment. And it's, you know, it's a sort of extremely delicate balance to walk, to not, I guess, give in to this sort of salaciousness of pain, and to try, at least I try to bring to those projects as much as I can, the memory of the kind of beauty that was lost, and actually how can we cling on to the fact that if that loss hadn't have happened, or if we stop it repeating now, a lot of extra beauty will remain in our lives and in our world. So kind of to try and shift it slightly into that perspective.
Let's stay there for a second, because I think what's important is the act of joy. And how do each of you, in your work of monumentality, try to bring in moments of joy and delight and relief, as opposed to canonizing pain or terror or dominance or colonialism or imperialism? How do you find ways to do that within your respective practices?
Multiple ways I could answer that question, but I think the one that's most top of mind for me is all of our projects, all of our work is in service of another organization, another entity, right? We do not generate our own projects. And what I have found with every project that we're working on is, as a designer, using your skills and your tools to support someone else telling their own stories, reflecting on their own experiences, has always resulted in some level of joy. I'm coming into this work and I'm thinking these stories are so wrought with pain and with harm, and this history is so challenging to confront, and yet you engage with our project partners and you're sitting across the table from them, and they are tenacious, they are determined, they are relentless, they are encouraged, they are powerful, they are, all these wonderful attributes of folks who are determined to signal to a future generation that your history matters. Certainly there is pain in that, but that pain can be transformed into power, into agency. And so I find joy in being present enough to hear other people tell their own stories.
And I find that people celebrate when they see themselves in these public spaces. What comes out of a feeling of belonging is a feeling of ownership, and the response is celebration, joy and celebration. And so even, with the Point of Action project, I would see Instagram posts, and I oftentimes remember this one woman, middle of the night, she was on roller skates and she had her glittery catsuit, and she was standing in one of those sculptures, just dancing. She was doing that, for minutes. She found herself in that space, right? Allowing people to find some kind of connection because they feel seen, they see themselves reflected. The response is going to be joy and celebration, whether individually or communally in any of these spaces.
You probably noticed that joy is quite important in a lot of my work. But I think the reason that it comes across that way is that I think for me, it's the way that I communicate with with my clients, but also the occupants in the work that I do in the city is through the senses more than anything. So, my work, as much as possible, has a lot of research, a lot of working with historians and communities, but I try not to have that embedded in the final product. So I talked a lot about souvenirs and the kind of reduction down into aesthetics and objects. And that's important because I try to make things which operate on the level of the body and of the senses and through craft and materials. And there's a story behind it, but also people who come across the monuments or the installations or the sculptures, they can relate to it without knowing any of the backstory or not being from that community. They can relate to it on a kind of instinctive and sensual level. So that level of crafted materiality and sensuality for me is a kind of way of broaching a barrier with some of the people who might be around the work who aren't directly from the community involved.
So I think now will be a great opportunity to open up questions to the audience. We have a microphone that's there. So I think you got a hand over here. And these can be direct questions to a single panelist or general questions to all the panelists.
Thank you. This is a general question. How do you, it might be a little loaded, I'm sorry, but how do you navigate creating spaces in monuments for groups that you personally don't identify with, especially since the architecture field itself lacks a lot of diversity and there aren't always people that are able to speak for themselves or advocate for themselves, and you obviously have more experience. How do you kind of handle that and say, no, I'm not from this community, but this community still deserves to be heard? How do you kind of navigate that?
Okay.
You want me to ask it again? Okay, so the question was, how do you all as designers and architects design monuments for groups that you yourself don't represent?
I think the process is multi-layered, right? So there's a kind of research, which is secondhand research in terms of really getting to know the place as much as you can. And then another part is really crafting these different engagement sessions with people who live there and understanding that the engagement sessions can take form in multiple ways. And it can't just be one, right? And it can't just be one group. So an important thing is to understand, how do you go into communities and being invited in or getting into the communities through already trusted organizations so that people are comfortable with sharing with you whatever their experiences might be, but also so that there isn't a dynamic of, a kind of power dynamic as you, the designer, coming in and them feeling deferential to you because you have a certain kind of professional capability. So it's really, really important to work with trusted partners and really going into any community with as empty a mindset as possible so that you're doing deep, meaningful listening and then stepping back. So no pen should meet paper until you get the kind of full awareness of what that community is about.
I would briefly add, in addition to the borrowed trust, a part of your question where you said, you have more experience than those communities that don't necessarily have agency to tell their own stories. I would change that way of thinking, because you do not have more experience than someone who has lived a history that they are looking to memorialize or monumentize, right? So I think it's about understanding the importance and the value in lived experiences, and understanding the importance and the value in trained experiences, if you will, and really taking the time and the energy that is necessary to collaborate in that way and think about, okay, I have a tool, you have a tool, how can we co-create? How can we co-build? How can I defer to you in moments where it's important, and how can you defer to me in moments when it's important? But I think that collaboration and that honest spirit of collaboration is very important when you're working with communities that you do not feel like you necessarily are a part of, but are looking to work in service of.
Yeah, I just say, basically you said everything. I just say, I guess for me, due diligence at the beginning of a project is really important, to find out who's the client, who do they really represent. A project can sometimes seem on the surface like the most wonderful, exciting thing for the most brilliant community, but dig down into who they are, because it's kind of, so most of the work that I do are actually from communities that I'm sort of variously in the Venn diagram part of, and I'm very, very wary about stepping outside of that, probably for the same reason that you're asking the question. And when I do, I try to make sure as much as possible that the clients I'm working for, in a way, are going to be leading me, and I'm there to listen and work with them, but they have to be a sort of, a reliable group who really do represent who they say they represent.
We got one hand here, and then the gentleman back there will follow.
I just want to know what your opinion is on the fact that a lot of times in architecture school, we are not taught about monuments like these. It's more Eurocentric and, white-based, white people-based. So what is your opinion on that? And why do you think it is not taught in school as much? And why do we focus on sometimes the uncomfortable monuments, even though we know the past about it, or
Did everybody hear that question?
Sorry.
The question was, why in many forms of academia, schools of architecture across the country, do we start with the Eurocentric perspective of monumentality and practice consistent erasure of other communities and their monuments, and trying to understand if that is correct or an incorrect way of going through the profession?
I'm gonna ask the professor over here to answer the question. But
She's a professor?
you too.
I think for a very long time, the Academy just reinforces what they know, right? And it's our duty at this time to really uncover a lot of the architectural history that has been there all along, right? It's not new, but how do we start to add to the canon this larger understanding of what architecture is, who is making and creating space in different ways, and how do we incorporate that into architectural learning, right? So not only the monumental, but also the everyday. And when we speak of the monumental, what does that mean? How does it manifest itself in different communities across the world? And how can we all learn from each other? And also, how can we identify when many of the Western tradition has already been borrowing from practices from around the world?
So I can give you a short answer, and then we'll jump to the gentleman over there. One, because you work for me, so I can just tell you this on the side. But separate from that, we have to understand a couple baseline things. One of those is that the profession, academia at large, has been generally from a single type of author. And those authors put out in the world the work that they know. A lot more diverse work that you're searching for, which has always existed, may not have had the storytellers to talk about that work. And so part of the lack of resources is the lack of bodies within these academic spaces to then tell these stories. Because oftentimes you come from a perspective of knowledge that you already have. And so as someone of the US from the Great Migration, I know nothing about what it means to be from West Africa. So that's a giant gap in that story unless we have someone that's an expert on that. So I always try to tell you all students, it's not about erasure of previous histories and stories, because those are necessary to understand the built environment, the globe, how we got to this point. It's important to expand that, however. And as we expand, put them on equal footing. Because one came first doesn't mean that it should usurp those that come after. And so you're seeing work by Adam, by Nina, by Ja, and this is the kind of precedent creating work that now we should be embedding into syllabi, into curriculum, so that you all can see this kind of work and students after you can see that kind of work. And the last thing I'll say is, and this is the most important, I have to stress this. Part of this is on you as students as the next generation. And the reason it's important is, say none of you choose to be a professor. None of you choose to be the person that can mentor the next version of you. Instead, you absorb the work from us and then force us to keep doing it. When at some point, we would like to take a break. So, I put the onus back on you all to search out this type of work, to bring in your own histories, your own stories, your own legacies, your own families, like the workshop we did earlier, and then use this as leverage to create a new canon, a more expansive canon, a more respective canon of the global majority. Is that fair? Cool. We had a question over there in the back. Gentleman with the
Germane,
hat.
can I just add one?
Oh, sorry, go for it.
One thing, just because adding to what you're saying, because like my attitude with the book, which was a kind of evolution of my more, I guess, aggressive activism of the past, was to precisely have that attitude of additive history, of expansion, not the kind of rearrangement or the removal, which I think in the academic environment is really helpful because it can just expand endlessly. But I did find, though, that people need to be taken on a journey, because even just by having new material to be added, which looks to be from a tradition that is in some way antithetical to the great man who does shapy concrete buildings, people can react really aggressively because they think that you're trying to erase them. But actually what I've found is once you do start to have those conversations in academic context, pretty quickly people open up and start to really enjoy the material that you're bringing forward once they realize that they're not in danger and that their interests are not in danger. So I really like what you said, basically.
Here you go, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with virtually everything you've said, but monuments exist in public space and they're essentially ideological. And one of the things that concerns me about monuments generally is that, and particularly now in multi-ethnic societies and increasing cosmopolitanism, they automatically fuel social polarization. So, I mean, for example, in Britain, we have this example of the tearing down of the monument in Bristol to Colston, who was a massive, beneficiary of the slave trade. And his monument was, and I understand completely why it was pulled down, but actually, I think one of the things that managed to do was embolden the far right, because it was a simple symbol of anti-wokeness. I actually, thinking of it in retrospect, it might have been better to keep it there and put an alternative monument next to it, but I'm not absolutely convinced that in the end, monuments really do anything apart from make people who agree with that position feel better. Sorry.
Oh,
Is this
great
on?
question.
Yeah, I'm kind of happy that the Colston statue was pulled down, because I think the actual action has become a monument. So the memory of that being pulled down and thrown into the semi-dry dock at the time has become like such an iconic moment. And I just, yes, they do drive, I guess, division in the sense that, you know, certain groups don't agree with what different monuments represent, but that's always been the case. Everything is contentious in a liberal society when you're putting things up that mean something to one group but might mean something different to another. And I just think that's fine. I mean, that's what happens in Parliament. Our cities can kind of embody that. And in a way, I'm kind of all for the kind of monument inflation. Just have more of them from more different groups, kind of added to the city in the way that Greek cities used to just be full of thousands of statues, and most people didn't know what any of them were, but they meant something to particular religious sects or groups.
Yeah, I would say that I think that they do a little bit more than just make the particular group that's represented feel good. And even if that is the case, there's a lot of groups that deserve to feel good in this world, so I would render that a success as well. But I think in addition to that, I feel like monuments also allow for or generate dialogue in the public discourse in a way that other medias and other mediums of communication necessarily do not, right? If you are forced to encounter with a history that is different than your own, or a history that is your own in a public space, rather than necessarily having to enter into an institution to seek out that knowledge, then perhaps you're confronted with an opportunity to have a conversation that otherwise might not necessarily occur. And so I do find them to be building grounds or foundations for continued dialogue in a way that some of our other tools and resources as a society does not necessarily afford us.
And I think in all our work, we're reimagining what monuments are in a way that we're understanding that they're telling nuanced stories, right? And that we're recognizing that all of these, whether it's a moment in history, a longer spans of history, or a spans of the present, whether it's a living monument, it's deeply nuanced, there's lots of complexity, and it leads you to leave and continue the conversation in other spaces in private. I think that's the benefit of what we're hoping to do with our work.
We have one last question. I'll pass my mic because it's quicker.
Germane, can I just also add that I think conflict is good, because I think when you try and suppress a lot of these opinions and they're hidden, people don't really realize how much resentment there is. And actually when these things come out into the open, I think that's one of the great benefits of living in a multicultural liberal society. You hash it out. And I think so that kind of non-violent, aggressive cultural conflict is necessary.
First of all, I just want to say thank you for this input that each of you have, and I like that there's courage in expressing what you do, and I'm adding on to the previous questions of like, especially in this country, there's importance in freedom of expression, right? So oftentimes, I'm sure all the monuments and projects are faced with positive reactions, but are there strategies that you employ to address and react back to negative reactions like vandalism of monuments? And what are the ways that, you know, if you have example of projects that have faced that, if there's preventative measures or restorative measures? Yeah.
I will try to be brief and just say, for anyone that was following the news for the unveiling of the Embrace project that I spoke to in Boston, there was a lot of negative press that followed that unveiling. There was a lot of confusion and critique about the form. Folks found it to be too abstract. There were a number of people that found that the lack of resemblance of the kings was disrespectful, that the fact that their likeness was not represented was actually problematic and was a continuance of erasure of Black history, and et cetera. And what our team decided before the unveiling, throughout the competition process, throughout the design process, and certainly in response to that, is that ultimately we were still committed to the notion that the purpose of that project was to represent a concept, to represent an existence of the kings, which was rooted in love, and to respond to the importance of collective action, and that we were intentional in, as I mentioned before, stepping away from this notion of singular hero worship, because there is an abundance of statues with MLK's likeness littered across this country and across the globe. And so this was an opportunity to actually talk about something that the kings embodied as people, as a couple, as individuals, and we held on to that. And so I think anticipating that not everyone is going to understand everything that you put out into the world, but holding on to your purpose, your intent, what it is that you are trying to communicate, is a way through some of those conversations. But again, the conflict is healthy, the dialogue is healthy, and I think it is an important opportunity to understand that communities and people are going to interpret art, memorial, and cultural objects differently, and that is okay as well, right? It doesn't all have to be absolutely accepted, so.
I do have to end us, only because we're at 3. There's somebody else coming in afterwards. But first, can we give a round of applause to our amazing panelists? They will be floating around, and this is the opportunity where if you might be a bit too shy to grab the microphone, you can have more intimate discussions with these amazingly brilliant people. And give a round of applause to yourself for sitting here for an hour. Thank you.